Welcome to the deep dive. You know, it is kind of funny when you really think about it. We constantly upgrade the technology in our pockets, right?
Oh, absolutely. Every year there is a new model.
Yeah, and we complain constantly when our smartphone battery drains too fast. Because, we've got all these background apps running. They just eat up our processing power, completely invisible to us.
Right, running in the background while you were just trying to send a text.
Exactly.
Huh.
But when it comes to our own brains, we walk around assuming we are, completely in control. We think every single choice we make is a conscious, deliberate tap on the screen.
Well, I mean, it is a very comforting illusion,
Mhm.
but the reality is far more automated than that.
How automated are we talking?
About 40 to 45% of what you do every single day is actually just a habit.
Wait, really? Almost half.
Almost half of your waking life is running completely on autopilot.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because for almost half of my day, those background apps are just running the show, draining the battery, and I am not even fully conscious of the choices I am making.
That is exactly what is happening, yeah.
So today we are decoding those invisible scripts. Using Charles Duhigg's research into the science of habit, we are going way beyond the basics, not just, what you eat or how you work.
Right, the internal stuff. We are looking at the external habits, too.
Exactly. How we communicate, how we argue, and how we actually connect with everyone around us. We are going to explore the literal blueprint for rewiring your brain and your relationships.
And what is fascinating here is the physical reason why this massive automation happens. It all comes down to this little golf ball-sized structure near the center of your skull.
The basal ganglia, right?
Yes, the basal ganglia. Its entire evolutionary purpose is just to recognize patterns and turn them into automatic routines.
Because, if every time you walk down a dirt path, you had to consciously deduce whether to pick up an apple or a rock to eat, the cognitive load would just be too much.
You would be paralyzed. You would never accomplish anything. So it is an efficiency engine.
That makes sense.
Hmm.
The brain is just trying to save energy.
Exactly. The human brain is incredibly energy hungry. It consumes about 20% of your body's calories.
Wow. Just to run the hardware.
Right. So to conserve that precious fuel, it shifts the workload. When a behavior becomes a habit, your prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for complex decision-making, logic, willpower, it literally powers down.
It just goes to sleep.
It goes to sleep. The basal ganglia takes over, and it executes the routine totally mechanically.
Okay, so since most of you listening are already familiar with the basic anatomy of a habit, the cue that triggers it, the routine itself, and the reward that reinforces it, we know the basal ganglia doesn't moralize.
No, not at all. It doesn't distinguish between, say, running 5 miles and smoking a pack of cigarettes.
It just connects the cue to the reward, period.
It is a purely mechanical function. So if you try to quit smoking by just throwing away your cigarettes and relying on sheer willpower, you are fighting a losing biological battle.
Because the code is still there?
Right. The cue and the craving pathway still physically exist in your brain. Meanwhile, your prefrontal cortex is getting completely exhausted from trying to actively suppress the urge.
So what does this all mean? If it is not about character or willpower, is it just bad programming? Because relying on willpower to stop a habit is like trying to hold an inflated beach ball underwater.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
Right. Like you can force it down for a little while, but eventually your arms are going to get tired.
They always do. You get stressed, work gets crazy, that prefrontal cortex gets fatigued.
Your arms give out, and boom, that beach ball explodes right back to the surface.
Exactly. When that inevitable stress hits, you see that old cue, maybe the street corner where you used to smoke, and you just thoughtlessly revert to the behavior.
So how do we actually fix it without just relying on our tired arms?
Well, the golden rule of habit change dictates that you cannot extinguish the loop entirely. You must insert a new routine while keeping the old cue and the old reward intact.
Okay, but if the secret is swapping the routine, the real challenge is identifying those hidden cues and rewards. Because they aren't always obvious, are they?
No, they really aren't. They can be incredibly sneaky.
Right. Like Duhigg shared this highly relatable anecdote from his time as a reporter. He developed this terrible habit of going to the cafeteria every afternoon to eat a cookie.
Oh, yeah, the famous cookie experiment.
Yeah. He even put Post-it notes on his computer saying, do not eat cookies. But his basal ganglia would just ignore them completely.
Because the basal ganglia doesn't care about a Post-it note.
Yeah.
He had to become a scientist of his own life.
So how did he do that?
Well, cues almost always fall into one of 5 distinct categories. It is usually a specific time of day, a particular place, the presence of certain people, a specific emotion, or a preceding behavior that has become ritualized.
And by tracking his urges, he found his cue was strictly time-based.
Yeah.
Right. 3:30 p.m.
Exactly. 3:30 p.m. every day, the urge hit. But the reward part is where the mechanism gets really tricky.
Because a reward is essentially a complex package. Like, he initially assumed the reward was just the delicious cookie itself.
Right, but researchers suggested testing different hypotheses. A cookie represents a whole bundle of potential rewards.
So he tested them. Like, was the reward the physical energy from the cookie? He tested that by drinking a cup of coffee instead.
And the craving remained. So it wasn't energy, was it the sugar? He tested that by putting Splenda directly on his tongue.
Which, by the way, sounds absolutely awful. Just raw Splenda on the tongue.
Sounds terrible. And it didn't work. The craving still didn't go away.
So what was it?
Finally, he realized that when he went to get the cookie, he would inevitably chat with colleagues. The true reward wasn't sugar or energy. It was 15 minutes of social interaction and office gossip.
Wow. So the cookie was literally just a convenient vehicle for connection.
Exactly. So he utilized a psychological tool called implementation intentions.
Implementation intentions. What does that actually look like?
It involves creating a specific, preloaded script that bypasses the need for conscious decision-making in the moment. His new loop became, at 3:30 p.m., stand up, find a friend, and gossip for 15 minutes.
By defining those if X then Y parameters ahead of time, he satisfied the underlying craving, and the urge for the cookie just vanished.
It completely vanished. And this really highlights the true neurological nature of cravings. They're just the brain's anticipation of a reward.
And when your brain sees a cue and expects a reward, and you don't provide it, you experience a literal, measurable sense of depression, right? Like the dopamine levels actually drop.
They physically drop, yes. Which is why building new habits, like exercise, requires immediate reinforcement. You have to manipulate those dopamine levels.
So your brain needs an immediate hit to connect the physical exertion to a positive outcome.
Yes. Taking a long, luxurious shower or having a small piece of chocolate right after a run that cements the loop in the basal ganglia.
But instead, most of us rush through a run, panic because we can't find our keys, rush to get out the door, and arrive at work super stressed.
Right. We are literally punishing ourselves for exercising. So the brain catalogs that stress and decides running is just a miserable experience to be avoided.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. What if the craving feels completely overpowering? What if someone feels like their bad habit is just fundamentally who they are?
That is a huge misconception. Cravings do not condemn you to an identity. They simply represent the cues and rewards currently dominating your environment.
So it is an environment problem, not a character flaw.
Exactly. While genetic predispositions do exist for certain behaviors, they are not destiny. A craving is a reflection of your surroundings.
Change the environment, remove the cues, and find healthier ways to get those emotional or physical rewards.
Yeah.
And the craving loses its power.
Exactly. It completely loses its grip on you.
That reframes everything. It shifts the internal narrative from, I lack discipline to I am just existing in an environment full of unhelpful cues.
Which is a much more empowering way to look at it.
And neurologically, if one tiny shift in routine can rewrite a single loop, like a 3:30 cookie habit, applying that shift to a foundational routine creates a massive domino effect.
Yes, and these are known as keystone habits.
Keystone habits. Break that down for us.
Keystone habits are foundational behaviors that, when altered, unintentionally shift other patterns across your entire life.
Unintentionally.
Yeah. For example, when people who never worked out suddenly start running, they obviously get fitter and eat healthier. But data shows they also start spending less money on credit cards.
Wait, really?
Yeah, they procrastinate less at work, and they even start doing their dishes earlier in the day.
Okay, wait. So if I just force myself to go jogging for 2 blocks, my brain is suddenly going to make me a financial genius. What is the actual mechanism linking physical exertion to keeping an Amex in your wallet?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the mechanism is a fundamental shift in self-image. Your brain is constantly observing your own behavior to determine who you are.
It is watching me to figure out my identity.
Yes. When you do something you previously thought you couldn't do, like waking up early to run, a part of your brain records that data and updates your identity. It decides, I guess I am a disciplined person now.
Oh, wow. So once you hold that new identity, making other disciplined choices like skipping an impulsive purchase suddenly aligns with who you believe you are.
Precisely. To find your keystone habit, you have to look for the change that feels irrationally scary.
Irrationally scary, like buying running shoes shouldn't trigger anxiety, but it often does.
Right. Or maybe it is avoiding a tough conversation with your mom that you have been putting off for years.
So that irrational anxiety is actually a neon sign pointing to a keystone habit, because your brain anticipates that taking that action will force a massive, uncomfortable update to your identity.
Exactly. And updating your identity requires a deeply ingrained belief that change is actually possible. This is where community serves as a vital catalyst.
Immunity. Like the 12 steps in Alcoholics Anonymous.
Perfect example. The 12 steps themselves aren't rooted in clinical neuroscience or specific religious doctrine. They really serve as a behavioral framework.
So they are a mechanism to practice the muscle of belief in a communal setting.
Right. You sit in a room, you see someone who has been sober for 9 months, and you think, if they can change, I can definitely change.
It provides literal, empirical evidence of transformation. Belief becomes a group activity. You don't have to overhaul your entire life all at once.
No, you just change one irrationally scary thing, you build that belief muscle, and then you watch the rest of the dominoes fall.
Okay, so we have established how our internal lives are run by habit loops. But our external lives, how we interact with the world, are governed by the exact same mechanics, aren't they?
They absolutely are. The reason human beings have been able to build civilizations and dominate the planet is our capacity for complex communication. It is the ultimate outward keystone habit.
And there are individuals who have totally hacked this system, often referred to as supercommunicators.
Yes, super communicators. And these aren't just people born with magical charisma. They actually treat conversation as a set of mechanical skills.
They recognize the cues and rewards of human interaction. And the ultimate reward of a great conversation is this biological phenomenon called neural entrainment, right?
Yes, neural entrainment. It happens because of mirror neurons in our brains. These are cells that physically fire both when we perform an action and when we observe someone else performing it.
So when you truly connect with someone, your brains literally start syncing up.
Literally syncing up. Your heart rates match, your breathing aligns, and even your pupil dilation mirrors each other.
That is wild. And from an evolutionary standpoint, syncing up meant a tribe could hunt together, anticipate danger together, and ultimately survive.
Exactly. But to achieve that biological sync today, you have to realize that every time you open your mouth, you are engaging in one of 3 types of conversations.
Okay, the 3 conversations. Let's list them. First, the practical conversation. Are we solving a problem?
Right. Second, the emotional conversation. Are we sharing feelings? Do you need to be hugged?
And third, the social conversation. Are we relating to each other's identities? Are we being heard and acknowledged?
Yes. And most communication breaks down because of the matching principle. You must be engaging in the same kind of conversation at the same time.
So if someone comes to you in an emotional mindset, upset about a problem, and you respond with a practical, step-by-step solution.
The interaction fails completely. It is like ships passing in the night.
It is like trying to plug a USB-C cable into a 20-year-old headphone jack. Like, you physically have the hardware, and you are trying to push them together, but the data just cannot transfer.
That is a perfect way to picture it.
But why does that happen? Why can't an emotional brain process a logical solution?
Because the emotional centers of the brain, specifically the amygdala, physically override the prefrontal cortex.
So when someone is highly emotional, their threat response is activated.
Yes, their brain is prioritizing immediate survival and processing intense feelings. It is literally blocking out executive reasoning. They physically cannot hear your logic until their emotional state is regulated.
But how do you actually figure out which conversations someone wants without, like, awkwardly asking a stressed coworker, hey, do you want to be helped, hugged, or heard right now?
Well, this raises an important question. Supercommunicators solve this by asking deep questions.
Deep questions. Meaning what, exactly?
A deep question doesn't mean probing into intense private trauma immediately. It means asking a question that prompts the other person to talk about their values, their beliefs, or their personal experiences.
Oh, I see. So instead of asking, where do you work, you ask, what made you decide to go into your field?
Exactly. You invite them to explain how they see the world. Deep questions are the ultimate cue to trigger the reward of neural entrainment, especially in high-stakes or high-conflict situations.
Like the story of Dr. Abadai, right?
Yeah.
The prostate cancer surgeon in New York.
Yes, an incredible story. Patients would receive a cancer diagnosis, and he would provide purely practical advice. He would explain the tumor was slow-growing and recommend active surveillance.
Which basically just means monitoring it without invasive surgery. Very logical.
Very logical. But the patients would nod in the office, and then days later, they would demand immediate surgery, completely ignoring his expert medical advice.
Because he was locked in a practical mindset while they were drowning in an emotional one, their threat response was blocking the logic.
Exactly. So Dr. Abadai shifted his approach entirely. With a new patient, instead of launching into the practical medical lecture, he started with a deep question. What does this diagnosis mean to you?
Wow. And then what happened?
The patient revealed that his own father had died of cancer, and he was terrified of inflicting that same trauma on his family. He didn't need a medical plan yet. He needed empathy.
So Dr. Abadai used a technique called reciprocal vulnerability. He shared that his own father had been sick, which validated the patient's anxiety.
And the result was staggering. A 70% increase in patients actually following his medical advice from that point forward.
Wait, I have to challenge this, though. If someone is crying to me about their problems, doesn't reciprocal vulnerability just make it all about me? Isn't that selfish?
I get why it feels that way, but no. The distinction lies in the biological signal of vulnerability. Neurologically, vulnerability is a cascade that triggers whenever you say something you can be judged for.
Okay, so when someone shares a deep fear, their brain goes on high alert, anticipating judgment or rejection.
Right, and if you respond by offering something you can be judged for, you aren't stealing the spotlight, you are signaling to their amygdala that this is a safe space.
Ah, so you extinguish their threat response by proving you are in this together, which allows that neural entrainment to finally occur.
Exactly. And another amazing tool, especially for when you are actively in a conflict, is looping for understanding.
Looping for understanding. This involves 3 steps, right? Step 1, ask a question. Step 2, repeat back what they just said in your own words.
And step 3, which is the most frequently skipped part, ask for permission to see if you got it right. Am I understanding you correctly?
People always skip that part. Why is it so important?
Because that third step proves you are genuinely listening. It removes the defensive fire from the conflict. This is especially critical in the social conversation, where people bring their core identities to the table.
Like a debate over gun control. If someone starts by saying, as a gun owner, they are announcing their identity and their lived experiences.
Right. And regardless of your political stance, if you immediately attack the issue, their brain perceives it as a literal attack on their core identity. The defense mechanisms activate.
So you have to validate their identity first. You loop for understanding by saying, I hear that your family has a history of using firearms responsibly.
Exactly. Once their identity feels acknowledged, the threat response lowers, and they become infinitely more open to hearing your perspective.
So why put all this effort into tweaking our habit loops and learning to match conversations?
Because the ultimate reward is literal survival and joy.
And the data backing this up is staggering. Look at the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It is a comprehensive 100-year study that searched for the secret to health, happiness, and success at age 65.
And the findings showed it wasn't cholesterol levels or childhood experiences or Ivy League degrees.
Nope. The single greatest predictor of health and happiness at 65 was having at least one close relationship at age 45.
Because the human brain evolved to exist in community? The U.S. Surgeon General has even equated the physical impact of chronic loneliness to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Wow, connection isn't just pleasant, it is a biological imperative.
It really is.
So to bring it all together, whether it is a craving for a cookie at 3:30 p.m., an irrational urge to avoid a conversation, or a tense debate with a coworker, we are all just running loops.
But we aren't trapped by them.
No. By diagnosing the cues, asking deep questions to match conversations, and practicing belief, we can actually rewrite the code of our lives. We have the blueprint.
It is entirely a matter of putting that science into practice in our daily interactions.
Which brings us to you. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Think about a friend you haven't spoken to in over 6 months. Someone you really like, but, you just drifted apart.
It happens to all of us.
It does. But if habits truly dictate our actions and communication dictates our relationships, what invisible cue in your daily environment is actually stopping you from picking up the phone right now?
Is it the time of day? A chronic feeling of being overwhelmed.
Identify that trigger. And ask yourself, what would happen if you altered just that one cue tomorrow morning? Start diagnosing your loops. We'll see you on the next deep dive.